And welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this evening we'll be talking a bit about the subject of Nibbāna, which is one of the most important topics in Buddhism. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll say a few words about the topic. And then if there's any questions, I'll respond to questions. So please feel free to type in questions at any time. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So when we talk about Buddhist practice, when we talk about the practice of Buddhism, it's important to understand what it is that we're trying to do in Buddhist practice. Buddhism is a method in order to arrive at a particular destination. And without understanding the destination, then Buddhism doesn't actually make any sense. It doesn't have any application. So Buddhism is itself a set of practices and concepts which incline the mind towards Nibbāna. Which lead towards a direct experiential understanding of Nibbāna. So it's important to understand that when we talk about Nibbāna, what we're talking about is, in fact, that which one is trying to directly realize, that which one is trying to have an experiential understanding of when one is practicing Buddhism. And the Buddha spoke about Nibbāna in many ways. The most straightforward definition that he gave is that Nibbāna is the complete absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. This is the most simple and straightforward explanation that he gave. It's the complete absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. He also sometimes spoke about Nibbāna in very simple terms. Actually, one of the very simple descriptions that he gave that we find in the suttas is he said, Nibbānang paramang sukhang. So Nibbāna is the highest happiness. Nibbāna is the highest form of pleasure, the most refined, the most sublime kind of bliss. So this is already starting to get us a little bit of a sense of both what we're aiming at and also how to get there. So Nibbāna is the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion. And also it is the most sublime and refined form of happiness. So this already gives us a sense. So what are we trying to do in Buddhist practice? Well, we're trying to eliminate greed, hatred, and delusion from the mind, and we're trying to cultivate unconditional happiness. So this is already cluing us in a little bit as to what we're trying to do. And also it then helps to illuminate what we're doing with the rest of Buddhist practice. So for example, when we talk about practices of renunciation and relinquishment, well, why? Because what's the opposite of renunciation and relinquishment? Well, the opposite is grasping and acquisition. The opposite is attachment and craving. So that would be in the category of greed, the category of things which generate suffering for the mind. So through the process of attachment and acquisition, we generate suffering for the mind. This constant seeking for happiness in specific objects or specific experiences. And this also, again, gives us a sense of the distinction the Buddha is making. When he says Nibbāna is the highest happiness, he's not saying that there aren't other forms of happiness, such as the happiness of good food, or the happiness of good friends, or the happiness of a nice entertainment or something of that sort. But rather he's saying that there is a higher form of happiness. There's a form of happiness which supersedes all others, which is the happiness of Nibbāna. So then when we're talking about momentum of craving or desire in the mind. It's built upon actually the delusion that these lesser forms of happiness are worth pursuing. It's actually worth pursuing the pleasure of entertainment, or the pleasure of praise, or the pleasure of wealth, or the pleasure of education, or the pleasure of any of the ordinary worldly pursuits that people tend to engage in. So why do they engage in these ordinary forms of pleasure? It's because they actually think that's what real happiness is. If we didn't think happiness was to be found in worldly pleasure, then we wouldn't bother. It wouldn't interest us. So then, again here, when we're talking about inclining the mind towards Nibbāna, this also is built upon cultivating disenchantment and dispassion. So Nibbāna and Viraga in Pali, disenchantment and dispassion. And the Buddha was quite clear that the cultivation of disenchantment and dispassion makes the mind naturally inclined towards Nibbāna. Once again, why is that? Because when the mind is obsessed, fixated upon conditional happiness, upon these limited forms of pleasure that we get through ordinary experiences, then the mind will not seek unconditional happiness. It will not seek a higher, more refined, more pure form of happiness. And the other thing here is also because when we're talking about Nibbāna, when we're trying to define Nibbāna, one of the ways that the Buddha defined Nibbāna, which actually I think is one of the most precise and clear definitions, the one that requires a bit of unpacking and explanation, is the Buddha defined Nibbāna as asankata, the asankata dhatu, or simply asankata, which if one knows Pali, that's actually sufficient, just to say that much. So sankata means constructed or fabricated, or something which is made up of distinct components, something which is conditional, something which is limited, something which can be described in terms of particular characteristics and components. So sankata is directly related to the word sankhara. And in fact, the two words are almost interchangeable in many contexts. So all of the ordinary things that we experience are sankata. They're constructed, they're concocted, they're fabricated, they're built up of specific conditions, and they have specific characteristics. And all sankatas, so all things which are conditioned and constructed and fabricated and concocted and conditional, so all such things, all have the nature of anicca, dukkha, and anatta, of being impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal. All of them have this the nature of being in constant change. They all have the nature of being unreliable. They all have the nature of being ultimately unsatisfying, in the sense that one cannot find ultimate happiness in any sankata dhamma, in anything which is sankata, anything which is constructed or conditional. So then the Buddha says that Nibbāna is asankata. It's the asankata dhatu. It's the aspect of the unconditioned. It's that which is not constructed, not fabricated, that which cannot be described in terms of characteristics and components, that which had no beginning and no end. So there's another characteristic of things which are sankata, is that because they are constructed, that means that they had a beginning and they have an end. Whereas the Nibbāna dhatu has no beginning and no end. Therefore, it is asankata. It is unconstructed, unconcocted, unfabricated, unformed. So then, again, so why is it that disenchantment and dispassion incline the mind towards Nibbāna? It's because as long as we are enchanted with sankata things, as long as we are fixated upon any discrete phenomenon, any thing, any physical thing or non-physical thing, any experience or object of any sort, then we will not look for the asankata. We will not look for that which is unconstructed, unfabricated, unconcocted. We will not look for that which is unconditional. We will not look for that which is outside the domain of finite, limited, conditional phenomena. So then again, when we talk about Nibbāna, we're talking about that which is not composed of discrete, distinct components. This is what's meant by asankata. And also something which has no beginning and no end. So also is another aspect of asankata. The Buddha also referred to Nibbāna as ajata, which means not born, and amata, not dying. So not subject to birth and death. This is the same meaning, in that it doesn't come into being and it doesn't cease to be. It's not born and it doesn't die. It doesn't arise or cease. So it has the nature of being unchanging. And this is only possible because it has no discrete components, no distinct parts. So, and it's important to understand that the Buddha said that the direct realization of Nibbāna, so the direct experiential understanding, so understanding through direct experience of Nibbāna, brings about the permanent and complete elimination of suffering. So the connection here might not be immediately obvious. So the direct experience of Nibbāna, the direct experience of the unconditioned element. So what is this talking about? So it's talking about feeling for yourself, personally and directly, that ultimately everything which we think of as real, everything which we relate to as a permanent, genuine object, all of that ultimately has the nature of emptiness. All of it ultimately has the nature of being formless. All of it ultimately has the nature of actually the asankata dhatu. So the underlying fabric of reality is without limits, it's without bounds, it's without shape. So whatever experience we're currently having then, although it feels perfectly real, it's only real from a specific perspective, which is the perspective that we're looking at it from. So it feels very painful. Why? Because we perceive it as absolutely real and we take it personally. It's not that there's nothing going on, but rather it's that we misperceive it as something permanently real and as personal. So when we recognize that all things have the characteristic of being impermanent and impersonal, then we're not bothered by them anymore. There's pain in the body. Well, it's impermanent and impersonal. So we're not bothered by it. We see it as insubstantial. We see it as not quite real in the sense that we normally relate to things as real. So then the mind no longer takes things seriously. So when there's pain in the body, instead of being like, oh, this is so awful, I have this awful pain, instead, the mind just recognizes, oh, this is just another impermanent, temporary, impersonal experience. There's actually nothing wrong here. This experience arose because of natural causes and conditions, and it will cease. In fact, it's already ceased. And something else is arising, and that's already ceased as well, and something else is arising, and so on. So then the mind doesn't fixate on any particular experience because the mind recognizes that all experiences have this characteristic of being insubstantial, which is another way that we can relate to the word asankata. So, and also recognizing that everything which we identify as me or mine is also insubstantial. It's like a mirage. It's like an illusion. It's like a magician's trick. It's something which seems to be real, but which is not quite real. So, and it's something which also has the nature of arising and ceasing, the nature of constant change. So whatever self-identity is currently present in the mind is not actually who we really are. It's just a mental construct which is currently present. And that mental construct is of the nature to change. It's arising and ceasing. Even as you watch, it's arising and ceasing. So whatever identity construct is currently present in the mind, well, that's not who we are. It's just another temporary arising. So then that means, once again, that we don't take anything personally. Whatever experience is currently going on, we recognize as just being a function of nature. And something which, like everything else in nature, is perfectly natural. And you can't argue with nature. You go outside in the winter and start arguing, you shouldn't be cold. Nature doesn't care. It's just winter time, and winter is cold. You go out in the summer and you start saying, it's not the right time to be hot. Well, nature doesn't care. Nature is just doing what nature does. It's not that nature hates you in particular, and that's why it's so cold. Or nature hates you in particular, and that's why it's so hot. No, nature is just doing what it does. It's expressing cause and effect. That's all nature has ever done and all it ever will do. It just unfolds cause and effect. That's all. So when we recognize this, then we stop taking anything personally. We recognize everything as just being a natural unfolding of cause and effect, which means that it doesn't bother us. We actually recognize that there's no one to be bothered, because also what we identify as me is just part of this natural unfolding of cause and effect. So there's actually no me to be found which could be bothered by anything. So in this way also, this direct perception of Nibbāna, this direct perception of the unconditioned, naturally leads the mind to the relinquishment of self-identity, and therefore the relinquishment of all suffering. So this is a brief introduction to the concept of Nibbāna. Of course, whenever we talk about this subject, it's important to recognize that our words are always going to be insufficient, because the concept of Nibbāna is in fact beyond the domain of words. It's beyond the domain of concepts and ideas. So whenever we use words, we're only ever pointing in the general direction of Nibbāna. So it's and these words are meant to help us to incline the mind in that direction. But it's only through direct experience that one can really genuinely understand it. But having some intellectual framework for Nibbāna helps us to orient the mind in the right direction. It helps us to understand why we're doing what we're doing in Buddhist practice. Again, why is renunciation such a critical part of Buddhist practice? Well, it's understandable when one recognizes that the ultimate goal is the direct experience of the unconditioned, which means we need to be willing to let go of everything that is conditioned. We need to be willing to let go of every discrete object, every discrete phenomenon, in order to see what's beneath it, what's beyond it, which is the asankata dhatu, the element of the unconditioned, the Nibbāna dhatu, the element of Nibbāna, nirodha dhatu, the element of cessation, which permeates and saturates everything, but which we normally don't notice because we're so fixated on the objects rather than the underlying objectlessness. We're so fixated on forms rather than on the underlying formlessness. It's kind of like when you're looking in a room, you notice the objects in the room, but do you notice all the empty space in the room? Do you notice the empty space that those objects are filling? Normally, no. Normally, we just fixate on the objects. Well, in the same way, as long as we're fixated on the objects in samsara, the objects in reality, then we will not notice the underlying formlessness, which is the asankata dhatu, the Nibbāna dhatu. So renunciation then is training the mind in letting go of sankata things, letting go of things which are conditioned, constructed, fabricated, letting go of things which are definable, so that we can see that which is undefinable, that which is unconstructed, unconcocted. So I see there's a few questions online, so I'll actually go ahead and switch to questions at this time and use the questions to further the discussion. So hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Julie, Rick, Suzanne, Manal, Mary, Jayanta, Luisa, Yankee, Bhumika, Ming Ming, Anata, Lee, Sleep Doc, Edward, Dabdulal, Karuna, Rachel, Tora, Olga, Bhante Pandit, hello, good to see you. Key, Anthony, Vajira, Sud, Pravin, Amaranta, Gregory, VL, Sudha, Kanpicha, and everyone else who's joining in. Wow, lots of people checking in. Good to see all of you. And so the first question I see here is from Sud. Sud, you always have lots of questions. It's wonderful. Keep it up. So Sud says, basically that state that is present without change is baseline state without any of these impermanent states is Nibbāna. So is it between these states of impermanence and background of these states? Not sure if I understood this correctly. Let's have a look here. That state that is present without change, it is true that the Nibbāna Dhatu is unchanging because there's nothing there that can change. There's no sankharas. The Nibbāna Dhatu has no sankharas, therefore nothing can change. The Buddha said, Sabbe sankhara anicca. And in the Nibbāna Dhatu, there are no sankharas. Therefore, there's nothing there that's impermanent, nothing there that changes. So it's the baseline state without any of these impermanent states. Slightly uncomfortable with referring to Nibbāna as a state. Because a state sounds like a sankhara. Sometimes I think of it more as the underlying formless fabric of reality, upon which or within which specific forms can appear when viewed through a delusional mind. Sometimes the way I think about it. And Praveen says, how does an enlightened person look like? Is it just cessation of suffering and becoming neutral / detached to joys and sorrows, non-reacting? Well, one thing that is notable about an enlightened person is that, one, they're not bothered by anything. So nothing ever upsets them or disturbs them. They're also never greedy. They have no desire to acquire anything in particular. They're also always kind. So one of the characteristics of an enlightened person is that they are overflowing with compassion. So they will never deliberately harm any sentient being, and they will always try to help the sentient beings that they encounter. And normally the way they try to help is by pointing out the Dhamma. That said, it's not always so easy to tell from the outside who's enlightened and who isn't. There's a lot of people who do a good job of pretending to be enlightened. They might seem very calm, very peaceful, very wise. And actually the Buddha said you could live together with someone for 100 years and not know for sure. Unless you can read their mind, which mind reading is relatively uncommon. So for most people, that's not a surefire method. But you can live with someone for a long time and not be certain. But if you observe someone over a long period of time and you don't notice any hint of desire, aversion, or confusion, then they might have some stage of awakening. That's possible. Anthony says, if everything in samsara is subject to birth and death, arising and cessation, doesn't Nibbāna transcend samsara by being outside birth and death instead of being an underlying aspect of samsara? Well, I mean, when we use words like outside or underneath or behind or within, I mean, these are all metaphorical because we're using spatial terminology to talk about something which cannot be defined in terms of a location in space. So Nibbāna cannot be said to be above or below anything. It can't be said to be outside or inside of anything because that's using spatial references in order to describe something which has nothing to do with space. So these words are used metaphorically in order to talk about how the Nibbāna Dhatu is a fundamental aspect of reality, which is inseparable from everything else, and yet not identical to everything else. This is actually summarized really beautifully in the Heart Sutra, by the way. So in the Heart Sutra, it says, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is not separate from emptiness, emptiness not separate from form. So it's pointing to the fact that the Nibbāna Dhatu is, it's not something somewhere else. It's not like we're here in the United States and then the Nibbāna Dhatu is in Canada or something. Like, it's not like it's somewhere other than where we are. Or like we're here in this universe, which is samsara, and next door is a parallel universe called Nibbāna. That's not what it's like. It's not like Nibbāna is somewhere else. It's already right here. It's just that we don't see it because we're not looking for it. We're so distracted by the sankharas, we're so distracted by the discrete phenomena that appear within samsara that we don't look for the Nibbāna Dhatu, even though it's literally right in front of our eyes. It's all around us. It's within us. It's everything. The Nibbāna Dhatu is already here in everything. It's already immediately apparent. It's just that we're not looking at it. We're not looking for it. We're looking at everything else except the Nibbāna Dhatu. So we don't see it, even though it's right here. And VL says, there is no self, there's only the body, brain, mind. Actually, there's not even that. Amaranta says, last year I read a book about Nibbāna called The Island, and it was difficult to me. It's a great book. It has a lot of really wonderful sutta quotes, which are talking directly about Nibbāna. So if you want to actually see a bunch of quotes from the suttas about Nibbāna and also see some opinions about a couple of highly respected monks. So opinions about the topic by a couple of highly respected monks, one of them being my own preceptor, Ajahn Pasano. It's actually a great book if you want to start to dig a bit into the topic of Nibbāna. It'll get you started. Another really great book, it's actually a series of lectures by Bhante Katukurunde Nyanananda called Nibbāna, the Mind Stilled. It's a series of 25 or 30 lectures, I forget the exact number, which were all on attempting to describe the nature of Nibbāna according to the Pali Canon, the early suttas. Particularly focusing on one of the concise descriptions that the Buddha gave. The Buddha said, etang santang etang panitang yaridang sabbasankara samato sabbu pariparinitsago tanhankaro virago nirodo nibbana. Am I missing one? Buddha? Did I get all of the adjectives? I think that's it. Okay. I might have missed one, but I think that's the full list. But yeah, it's hours and hours of just absolutely delicious explorations of this concise description of Nibbāna that the Buddha gives in a number of suttas. So it's called Nibbāna, the Mind Stilled, by Bhante Kattukurunde Jnanananda, a very famous Sri Lankan monk who passed away a few years ago. I wish I had met him before he died. He was a really remarkable monk. Rick says, what are the differences in the experience of Nibbāna and Parinibbāna? Well, so the prefix pari means complete. And in the suttas, at times, these two words are actually used interchangeably in many places in the suttas. So both meaning either this underlying state or the underlying aspect of reality, which is the asankata dhatu, or it's used to mean the experience of that underlying phenomenon, that underlying aspect of reality. In a few places, the term parinibbāna is also used specifically to mean the passing away of a fully enlightened being. But that's not universally how it's used in the suttas. In many places, it's used more or less synonymously with the word nibbana, to mean either that underlying nature of reality or the direct experience of that underlying nature. And Manal says, once the causal relationship of phenomena has begun to be more readily recognized, is this when dispassion actually stays and sticks? It certainly helps. So what leads to dispassion sticking is usually two things. One is recognizing the limitations of ordinary pleasure and having an experience of a higher pleasure. So the wisdom which recognizes the restrictive, limited, unreliable nature of ordinary pleasure, and ideally also which has had some experience of either the pleasure of deep samadhi, in particular the jhana states, or the pleasure of non-attachment, of non-clinging, of relinquishment. So an experience of deep letting go, again, usually during meditation. Julie says, is my understanding correct? Nibbana is not bliss, it is neutrality, feeling no more any wanting or not wanting, as well as no other delusion. This can feel scary in the beginning stages on the path. I'm very uncomfortable referring to Nibbana as neutrality, because the Buddha said, Nibbanang paramang sukhang. He didn't say Nibbana is the highest neutrality. He said Nibbana is the highest sukha, the highest bliss, the highest pleasure, the highest happiness. So I'm very hesitant to say Nibbana is neutrality. I think bliss actually is the proper word here. But it's the bliss of not wanting. It's the bliss of contentment, the bliss of non-aversion, the bliss of serenity. So it's a more refined form of bliss than, for example, the bliss of a nice pizza and some pop music. Like it's in a whole different category. So I'm very hesitant to refer to the pleasure of Nibbana as simply neutrality. That does seem to be missing what the Buddha is talking about. As for the scariness, so I have actually encountered some people who, when they start to get a little deeper into Buddhist practice, there's this fear that they're going to lose the pleasant things in life. Actually, remember during one retreat, there was a person who came and spoke with me after a few days and saying that they were terrified, that they were basically losing interest in all the things that bring them happiness, which actually is a good sign, by the way. When you're losing interest in ordinary worldly things, then that's actually a sign that the mind is inclining towards something higher. The mind is starting to recognize that those ordinary worldly pleasures are not particularly satisfying. But it's important that one has some kind of spiritual happiness that one aims the mind towards. So the advice I gave that person was to really focus on cultivating euphoric bliss during meditation, because you need to give the mind something to appreciate, or else it can just sink into depression. So if one starts to cultivate dispassion, but does not also cultivate the joyful side of Buddhist practice, then you can in fact sink into depression, which is not what Buddhism is for. So this is usually what causes that feeling of scariness, is one starts to get a glimpse of the hollowness of ordinary pleasure, but one does not yet have a grasp of the refined, serene, euphoric bliss which one can cultivate through Buddhist practice. So it's important to really actively cultivate euphoria, to actively cultivate joyfulness, especially during one's meditation practice. Amaranta says, they use the term atamiyata. Nibbāna is not made of something. Am I right? So the term atamiyata, this is actually a relatively rare word in the Pali Suttas. It only appears in a handful of places. It's usually taken to mean literally the aspect of not being made of that, as in it's not made of a specific thing. So the term atamiyata is almost synonymous to the word asankata, in the sense of not being constructed or concocted or compounded. So yes, Nibbāna is not made of something. That would be a correct way of understanding the term atamiyata. Anthony says, that which is unconditioned can't be related to that which is conditioned, i.e. the samsaric process. I'm not following your logic here. Isn't the closer relationship between Nibbāna and samsara later development after EBT? Again, I'm not following your logic here. That which is unconditioned can't be related to that which is conditioned. Why not? And yeah, I don't follow your logic. Yeah, maybe you can explain more clearly why you say that, because I don't see that as being a natural conclusion. And Anthony says, I use transcend beyond because of the imagery that the Tathagata goes beyond suffering. I tend to think of the underlying aspect of all experience to be dukkha, which is the opposite of nibbana dhatu. Yeah, sabbe sankhara dukkha. All sankharas are dukkha, whereas the nibbana dhatu is asankhata, therefore has no sankharas, therefore no dukkha. So this I agree with. Sud says, Dear Bhante, sometimes it feels like awareness is the common thing across all phenomenon. How is awareness related to Nibbāna and the teaching of the Buddha? Are you actually sure that awareness is the common thing across all phenomenon? You've never experienced awareness ceasing or disappearing? It's actually happening all the time if you watch. Awareness is always arising and ceasing. Awareness is not permanent. Awareness is just another sankhara. So awareness is not an aspect of Nibbāna because awareness is a sankhara. Therefore, it cannot possibly be an aspect of Nibbāna. And Real to Real says, road signs all state the direction of a place one is trying to find, yet when you arrive at the village or town, the concept of road signs becomes irrelevant. Yes, that's exactly true. The standard metaphor that we find in Buddhism is the finger pointing to the moon. So the finger is not the moon, but the finger is pointing in the direction of the moon. This metaphor is, as far as I recall, it's not found in this Pali Suttas. It's found later, but it's the same basic concept. The road signs help you get to the destination, but the road signs themselves are not the point. Hasanta says, if things are arising and ceasing every instant, how does attainment of Nibbāna fit with the 5 khandhas, i.e. steps 4 and 5 in particular? The 5 khandhas are all sankharas. Therefore, they're not present in the Nibbāna Dhatu. The Nibbāna Dhatu has no khandhas. So the realization of the Nibbāna Dhatu is also the realization of that which does not have the 5 khandhas. And VL says, the sensations happening in the body, brain, mind cannot be controlled. They just happen. That's partially true, and it's partially false, because we can also create the causes and conditions through intention. We can create the causes and conditions which generate different experiences. And in fact, Buddhist practice is all about taking control of the cause-effect process in order to generate the conditions necessary to realize Nibbāna. So generating the conditions necessary in order to realize the unconditioned. It's actually something deeply ironic at the heart of Buddhism, and that we use conditions to see the unconditioned. Gregory says, is the Nibbāna Dhatu synonymous with sunyata? Yes. In my opinion, yes. Yes. Though there are different opinions on this matter. But in my opinion, yes. Rick says, do the suttas describe a person's experience of Nibbāna in this life? It is indescribable. So descriptions are very limited and bare. They're not detailed because it is impossible to give a detailed description. Descriptions are sankharas. So when talking about Nibbāna, again, the Buddha uses intentionally vague terminology. He talks about it as the unborn, the undying, that which does not change, that which is unconditioned, unconstructed, unconcocted, unformed, that which doesn't arise and doesn't cease, that which is limitless. So trying to describe it in more specific terms is futile. So we don't find detailed descriptions in the suttas beyond what I've mentioned. So this is peaceful, this is sublime, that is the stilling of all sankharas, the relinquishment of all acquisition, dispassion, cessation, Nibbāna. These are the kinds of descriptions that we find. He says, how does this compare to the experience of Nibbāna after this life? Again, you're asking for descriptions of things that can't be described. So the Buddha wasn't concerned with trying to describe in detail the experience of Nibbāna. He was concerned with explaining how to get there. How to get to a point where you can directly experience Nibbāna for yourself. That's the point of the Buddha's teachings. Anthony says, I don't mean to be pedantic. When we use the word underlying, my mind reflects on dukkha, anusaya. I agree. Ultimately, the use of spatial terms in discussing this is inadequate. Yeah, understood. So this is part of the challenge in talking about Nibbāna, is that words are always going to be inadequate and misleading. So we have to do our best. And I understand why you shy away from the word underlying. And hopefully you understand why I shy away from the word outside. But both terms can be used as long as they're used carefully and used with sufficient qualification. Jeng has an off-topic question. Jeng, this would be better saved for mug chat on Friday evening. And Julie says, is Nibbāna reached when one becomes an arhat? And Sotapanna is when one experiences cessation of Namarupa for the first time, which is a glimpse of Nibbāna. So Nibbāna is reached when one becomes an arhat. That's correct. This concept that the experience of the cessation of Namarupa for the first time is Sotapanna, that concept does not appear anywhere in the Pali Canon. It first appears 1,000 years later in apocryphal texts and has led to 1,500 years of people thinking they're stream enterers when they're not. So no, Sotapanna is not experiencing cessation of Namarupa for the first time. No. Nope. And Jeng says, after detaching, I feel no joy or interest in this world. How meditation removes depression. Practice metta. Again, bring your questions to Friday evening mug chat. But as I said earlier, you need to cultivate the joyful side of Buddhism. So Buddhism is not meant to make you depressed. It's actually the exact opposite. So if you're experiencing no joy, then that's a sign that you're not practicing Buddhism correctly. So you need to deliberately cultivate the joyful side of Buddhism. Now bring that question to Mug Chat Friday and we'll talk about it in detail. Demson asks, is Nibbāna permanent? Oh boy, we're actually getting into one of these interesting points of scholarly debate that's been going on for millennia. In that if all sankharas are impermanent and Nibbāna is not a sankhara, does that then mean that Nibbāna is permanent? There is a way in which you could say yes, because it does not arise and doesn't cease. It's the only thing in all of reality which doesn't arise and doesn't cease. So in that sense, you could call it permanent. That said, there are a number of teachers which shy away from referring to Nibbāna as permanent because that creates certain potential pitfalls in the mind, which is why I hesitate a bit to give a straight yes to this. But I will say that the nature of the Nibbāna Dhatu is that it does not change. It's one of its basic characteristics. It does not change. Or it does not arise, it does not change, it does not cease. So if that fits your definition of permanent, then that would seem to apply. Gregory says, Nibbāna is unconditioned, but is anything dependent on it? Some call sunyata something like the ground of being, and I wonder if the analogy is apt. So rather, I would say that every single aspect of reality is irremovable, and every single aspect depends upon the existence of every other aspect. So all of reality, which includes samsara and nibbana, all of reality is necessary. All of it is necessary components of reality. Nothing can be added or removed. Everything is already here, and none of it can be removed. So calling sunyata or the Nibbāna Dhatu the ground of being, there is a way in which you can say that, but I'm not entirely sure how useful it is to talk in those terms. And Philurian says, what is the difference between nirvana and parinirvana? I already answered that earlier, so you can refer to that earlier answer. Rick says, can you talk about making progress on the path towards liberation in relation to letting go of lesser happiness for a greater happiness? That's borderline off topic. So I'm inclined to say, Rick, that you should bring this to Monk Chat Friday evening. You're normally at Monk Chat anyway, so I think that's reasonable. And that looks like the last question here. Are there any questions from the audience here? Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any such a thing as like an instant nibana?
Instant? Like it's always instant.
It's like less than a second.
It's always instant. It's always less than a second. It can't possibly be any other way. But building up the necessary conditions in order to have that instantaneous realization, that takes a long time. No? No? Okay, so that looks like it for this evening. So we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.